Hey everyone, welcome back. Today I'm just going to do one straight lecture again. I guess I should explain a little bit about the course schedule and the fact that I'm deviating from it so heavily. When I initially plotted this course, I could only upload certain lengths of videos onto the internet. Now I can do much longer ones, and so where on the course schedule it's always listed as 2 separate lectures, well, in the last 2 weeks I've put those 2 lectures together, and I'm going to continue to do that into the future. So that's where we're headed for the rest of the course. This is going to be the last lecture before we have our midterm exam. There's going to be a midterm review lecture, so there are going to be actually 2 lectures this week, but the midterm review is going to give you a little bit of an understanding of what the test is going to be like, and also go through some important information regarding said test. That review is going to be posted online on Wednesday. Actually Thursday, excuse me, I misspoke, Thursday. That's going to be online Thursday, and then the exam is going to open up a week from there, and it's going to go into your spring break. I understand that spring break is coming up, but you have a few days before spring break starts to complete the exam, but if you don't get it done during that time, you can always take it over your break. Sorry, but that's just how the schedule had to work out this term. So, all of that said, today we're going to be talking about what happened after the First World War, and we're going to be looking pretty specifically at France and at Germany. And here you can see the France chronology as it is set up. We're going to be talking about work from 1916 to 1938. That is roughly going to cover a development in art known as Surrealism. Obviously 1916 is not the end of the war. The war ended in 1918, but it's important to go back to 1916 to show you some earlier works to help contextualize what comes later. So those are the years that we are going to be following. Now, in this chronology, you're going to realize that timing really has a lot to do with how pictures are developed. Not necessarily how photographs are printed, because I know that sounds kind of confusing, but how art is, where it comes from. You know, the whole point of this course is designed to give you an understanding of how modern and contemporary art, or why it looks the way that it looks. And a lot of that has to do with timing. And so in this conversation that we're going to have today, I'm going to be talking a lot about what it meant to be in Europe after the war, in the same way that in the last part of our course, in the last lecture, I talked about what it was like to be around during the war. So all of that said, we have quite a bit of slides to get through, so I'm just going to go ahead and start moving forward. Again, with this week, I'm not giving you the slide lists. I realized in previous courses that, or I've come to realize that slide lists make people a little bit lazy with note-taking. And so rather than give you some Word document with all of the things that you would need to know for the exam, it's going to be better for you to actually write this stuff down. You writing it down means that you are processing the information. Even though it sounds really simple, it's a trick to help you get ready for this exam. If you write, let's say, in your exam, Henri Matisse, The Piano Lesson, 1916, you're going to remember the correlation between that information better than if I just give you a slide list. So I was a little bit nice in the beginning of the term, just kind of getting you guys into the run of things, but from now on there's going to be no slide lists published on Blackboard. So all the slide information that's said is going to be in text on these slides as they appear before you right now. So I will always give you the artist and title and date of the works of art that I show you, but I'm not giving you a separate Word document that compiles all of that stuff. So that said, here we have 2 paintings by Henri Matisse. One is from 1916 and the other is from 1917. The reason that I'm showing you these 2 works side by side is because they set up very obviously, I think, the distinction between works that were being done before the full weight of the First World War was felt in downtown Paris, and then a picture that arose after the full weight came to be understood. So basically, 1914, war breaks out. 1915, the numbers start coming back that people are losing their lives on those front lines. 1916, more numbers come back, but people are still hopeful that the war will end on a positive note. By the end of 1916, however, basically hope is lost. People have seen far too many young men go to the front lines, come back mangled by conflict, scarred psychologically by warfare, or just not coming back at all. And so there's a big sea change that happens between 1916 and 1917. And by looking at these two works by Matisse, you can really get a sense of how that affected the artistic community. Now, it might sound really kind of strange to talk about something so dire as international warfare with regard to artistic practice, but the merits of a course like 20th century art history can be found in a different sense of understanding how people processed conflict. You can watch hundreds of hours of History Channel TV that will tell you all of the different nuances about where Hitler was in 1933 and where he was in 1943. It's still not going to actually tap into your psychological understanding of what it was like to be alive there to just hear history lessons. That's why art is so powerful and where a lot of its importance can be found. By seeing the way that someone who's very of the vanguard, Henri Matisse, changes his pictorial style from 1916 into 1917, you can see very clearly how people are dealing with the war. Not the way that the borders are going to be redrawn, not the economic and those kinds of quantifiable hardships can be understood, but rather you can see psychologically what it feels like to live through this conflict. Now, talking about this surrounding the First World War, I'm trying to get you to think about the stuff that we're seeing in our culture today. How is our culture responding to the wars that we're currently embroiled in? I mean, we've been at war for decades now, and that has certainly something to do with how we interact with each other, how we interact with the world at large, and how we see ourselves as a nation state, but also as citizens inside of that nation that is arming us and sending us to conflicts whether or not we like them. So that's a little bit of the backstory. But to look specifically at these two works, and I'm going to harp on them for a second, what you see actually are two images of the same scene. In this scene, we have Henri Matisse's son sitting at a piano learning to play. In the one from 1916, you can see there's very little information about the set that this piano is placed within. We understand, because of this green wedge that exists right here, that might be a window, with this border here, this frame here, this balustrade there. We get the sense that there might be a green outside area just beyond those doors. This thing is perplexing. We don't quite understand how that operates. Is this a person who's giving the piano lesson? Is this another member of the family who's in the room for said piano lesson? And in this situation, look at the way he's rendered his son's face. There's a large triangle of peach paint. Oh, that's a weird way to mark it, excuse me. But that large triangle of peach that covers over one of Matisse's eyes, or Matisse Jr.'s eyes, is there because at this point, for the same reason that this kind of structure is there, that these kinds of questions are brought up, is because in 1916, Cubism was still a very prevalent mode for making pictures. The avant-garde was still involved with pushing artistic practices forward. They felt that there was a political mission that they were on. They were making artwork better for a world that could hopefully be better as well. By 1917, however, as I was saying earlier, the full brunt of the war had come into people's minds. And so what we witness in France is something that's referred to as the return to order, where the avant-garde put down its aesthetic armaments, and they decided that they needed to reinforce the traditional characteristics of their society. And so by 1917, Matisse gives us a lot more information in the depiction of the same situation. At the piano, we have again the younger Matisse learning how to tickle the keys, as it were. But there's more information regarding situations. If we compare this information, which you can read as a window if you just take a little bit of time and clue yourself into how it works. But in this picture, you can see very clearly that it is an outside space. There is a garden beyond those large French doors. And you can see outside that there is another person reading, but there's also a sculpture, what seems to be a pond, and some various plant life out there. This vague figure from the 1916 picture turns out to be a painting that is hanging on the back wall behind where the younger Matisse is learning how to play the piano. A funny corollary here is here we have a sculpture made by Henri Matisse, and here we have the artist himself imaged there, or what I believe to be the artist himself. I don't actually know who this is, but I imagine that this is a portrait of himself sitting in his room listening to his son learning how to play the piano. The reason why all of these things are made more concrete in the 1917 work is because the French order of telling stories in painting was coming back to its traditional elements. It needed to be structured around giving a comprehensible picture to an audience. Basically, French society didn't have the psychological ability to comprehend Cubism anymore, to fracture the canvas, or to synthesize all of those things back together at the end of it. Instead, they wanted pictures that harken back to this French tradition of making beautiful paintings and of being the premier art economy in the world. An interesting thing happened in Paris around that same time. You had artists like Amedeo Modigliani, whose last name I hope some of you recognize is not very French, and people like our favorite Pablo Picasso, who were artists that were based in Paris before the war broke out. Now, Picasso had been there since around 1899. Modigliani came much later. And both of these artists wanted to stake their claim in French painting history. Picasso didn't want to be from Spain, and so he moved and based his entire career in Paris. Modigliani didn't want to be in Romania, and so he came to Paris and established himself there. Modigliani is a Romanian who was living primarily in Italy before moving to Paris, just to clear that up. So after the war, these two artists, who were both very interested in pushing art forward, they were very much part of the vanguard, or the avant-garde, they realized that in order to stay in Paris and in order to pronounce themselves as part of the French painting culture, they needed to also return to order. They needed also to become more classicist, as in they needed to adhere to the classical traditions put forth by painters that we've looked at in our course, like Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres. Here we have Modigliani's Portrait of a Polish Woman, which harkens back to the days before the conflict, before Cubism, where painters in Paris were interested in rendering portraits of people that had also relocated to the French capital. Here we have an unnamed Polish woman, And in traditional Modigliani stylings, we have an elongated neck. We have a face that is very reminiscent of the traditional masks from sub-Saharan Africa that did influence the Cubists, but also a very European classicism in that facial structure as well. The fact that Modigliani chooses not to render pupils is a way that he is bringing in some sculptural traditions, because it's hard to render pupils in sculpture, and so Modigliani decided that he was also not very interested in rendering them in painting. So this is a pretty standard Modigliani portrait. From 1921, now the war has completely ended, and French painting has gone pretty entirely back to a classical tradition. We have the famed Fauvist rebel, Henri Matisse, who's now giving us very, very classical images of, in this case, an odalisque with red culottes. The culottes are the pants that she's wearing. Those of you who don't know, they're kind of like harem pants. An odalisque is, as I showed you in the beginning of the course, the Grand Odalisque by Ingres. An odalisque is basically the term for a female slave from the Orient, i.e. the Ottoman Empire. And so these were the women that made up the harems. And I'm sure all of you have heard the term harem before. So Matisse he's changing the way that this odalisque is rendered. This is not the perfect perfection of an Ingres painting. It's not painted with a brush that has one bristle on it. It's very brushy. It's almost watercolorish, but all that stuff aside, it is still a very traditional picture to render. A nude reclining woman, or a partially nude reclining woman, put out there for male observers to objectify, quite honestly. Also from 1921, Pablo Picasso gives us this, Woman and Child on the Seashore. Actually, this painting, in its original form, was made a little bit larger and included a likeness of the artist himself, and so it was family by the seashore. But after some personal issues in Picasso's life, he cut that part of the image out and framed it as such, with a woman and child sitting by the seashore. Now, this image is incredibly classicist for Pablo Picasso, who we know as the creator of Cubism. We know him also from his successive blue and rose periods that we talked about a few weeks ago. And so here, he's returning to those monumental forms of the rose period, and also the placid method for rendering these pictures. He doesn't want to leave France. He wants to stay in France. He sees himself at this point very much as a French painter. And so he's trying everything that he can, both aesthetically and politically, to stay within the borders of France. Now, interestingly, also from 1921, we have this work by Pablo Picasso. Three musicians. And I say interestingly because where Matisse very solidly drifts towards this ordered mode of making pictures, he was one of the artists that we can always look to as being part of that quote-unquote return to order. Picasso did become more orderly, did become more classicist, but he never put down the vanguard approach. And so here in 1921 we can see Cubism in its later phase. He's playing with both aesthetic systems at the same time. This work was not shown at the same time or in the same venue as the previous work, Woman and Child on the Seashore. They were made for very different audiences, they were shown in very different venues, and they were made for very different reasons. Picasso constantly was engaged with making art different and continuing it on the line of this progress that we've been talking about all term. But that said, he understood that he needed to do something that was quintessentially French, and so he made this work, Woman and Child on the Seashore. I bring up this work very specifically to introduce us to an idea called surrealism. So, 1917 to 1924 was what our historians refer to as the return to order. The specifics of those dates are not important. I'm not going to ask you about that on the exam. But 1924 is a very important year for a group of artists and writers as they came together under the title Surrealism. One of those artists is a man named Max Ernst. And here we have a portrait of a woman that he is friends and lovers with named Gala Eluard. And in this work, I think we can very easily see how artwork goes from a return to order, in other words, a return to representational work, and how it drifts after a few years into something that is more, again, avant-garde. It's more challenging to the viewer. It's more engaging for other artists to encounter. And so surrealism, as defined in this image of Gala Eluard, is a combination between what is representational and easy to read, i.e. this portion. You can very clearly see the person's eyes looking out. You can very clearly see the fact that this is supposed to be a representation of a human body. But the other side of surrealism is this side, the psychological side, the interior side. And so if we're going to look very specifically at one part of this painting as the indication or this pivot point between the return to order and what is going to become known as surrealism, we can look at this part of the painting, where Ernst has actually painted a trompe-l'oeil of what appears to be someone's mind or their head or their body unfolding, and so the viewer, instead of having a complete portrait of a likeness of Gala Eluard, they have half a portrait of likeness, half a portrait of psychological interior that's separated by this coiling, rolling down image. And so quite honestly, what Max is doing here is he is pulling back the veneer of everyday life and giving us an internal perspective of what it is like to be alive in 1924. Now, in the same vein as Dada and a few other future developments that we're going to cover in this course, artistic titlings like surrealism, like Dada, are actually initially born out of a literary source. And so here, I just want to give you a list of people's names that were influential in inspiring the surrealists. So we have, as you can see, a list of authors. The more important authors are the three top ones, the more important for our conversations. The three top guys, André Breton, Paul Eluard, and Guillaume Apollinaire. And the bottom character, Tristan Tzara. Tzara, I hope all of you remember as being the guy who pronounced pure idiocy as being the thing that we need to rescue modern culture. Well, after working with the Dadaists for quite some time in Zurich, and after the war ended, Tzara relocated to Paris, where he became friends with Breton, Eluard, and Apollinaire, as well as Vacher, Artaud, Aragon, and Supol. All of these men came together and talked a lot about what Tzara and these other folks had learned from their Dada experiments. They talked about the idiot and how in 1916 or 1914 that was a very important thing to pronounce. But by 1924, it's pretty well-worn territory, and we can figure out another way to take this conversation. And so they began to look back, and not just necessarily historically back, but also in the community of people around them. And they found thinkers like Alpha Jarry, who is the creator of the Theater of the Absurd, who gets a little bit of a shout out in our text, Arthur Rimbaud, Hegel, Walter Benjamin, and Herbert Marcuse. These writers looked to these resources and developed a system of literature that was examining and exploring what was going on inside of people's minds. This came out of the developing field of psychoanalysis. So, when people talk about Sigmund Freud and talk about Carl Jung in relationship to fine art practice, Surrealism is the moment where historically those two different aspects of human culture found each other. So Surrealism gives you Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic system as interfaced with artistic practice, but it starts off with authors. Now, I said in 1924 that was kind of the breakout year for the Surrealists. That's the year that André Breton penned the first Surrealist manifesto. So after the success of Futurism on the heels of its manifesto published in Le Figaro, a lot of artistic groups realized that they could get a little bit of attention by writing manifestos. The most successful of these second-generation manifestos comes from the Surrealists. And really, simply, this is what that manifesto breaks down as. I'm not having you read these manifestos because they take a lot of unpacking, and it's not the kind of, you're not going to gain that much from looking at the original source material. That said, if you do want to see them, they are very easily found on the internet, so don't be bashful with looking at that stuff. So, the first Surrealist manifesto is written by Breton, but there's a lot of Tristan Tzara in here. There's a lot of a continuation of the conversation about that sense of the idiot. The idiot is anti-middle class. Middle class is about order, it's about systems, and it's about everybody understanding where they fit in this newly industrial world. The Dadaists, Tzara specifically, said that we needed a little bit of a wrench thrown in the system in order to keep the system productive. Because without those wrenches, we're never questioning the system, and therefore the system doesn't ever grow. The Surrealist Manifesto gets a little bit more simplified, and they just say straight up, we're anti-middle class. Good taste is abiding by rules, and therefore good taste is to be questioned. That's exactly what Tzara was implying when he was talking about pure idiocy. But here's where psychoanalysis tips in. Because here, dreams were something that were had, obviously, before psychoanalysis, but it was in psychoanalysis that an understanding of dreams really became a popular conversation. Now, obviously, Freud and Jung were not the first psychoanalysts to deal with dreams, but they became the most popular and the most widely read. And so, by the time that those ideas get to Breton, we see this. The dream state is always privileged over the waking state, i.e., what goes on inside your brain. Think of the sand dollars falling into Gala Eluard's head from 2 slides prior to this. That's the dream state. The waking state are those eyes that you can very clearly make out. The dream state is the stuff above it. Privileged imagination, pure psychic automatism. What that means, automatism is a mode of making marks. It's automatic, automatism. So it's automatic mark making, i.e. if you take a pen, hold your hand out, close your eyes, and just kind of wiggle it around, that's automatic mark making. The Surrealists try as hard as they can to make that a mainstay of their practice. Internal images over external facts. think back again to Gala Eluard. And then it ends with existence is elsewhere. So, looking at this, the interior is privileged over, and in this case it is literally above the exterior. Existence being elsewhere implies it's inside the brain, not just what you're seeing outside. And that's why I'll always look to this painting as a great touchstone for conversation about surrealism, because even though I think that it might be a little oversimplified of an idea, it really does paint, it paints a good picture, to make a really stupid pun. I'm surprised I haven't made that really dumb pun yet. Well, there it is, everybody. So, here's another Max Ernst. It's from 1924. And in this work, he gives you a lot more questions than answers. This is not as easy to unpack. Two children are threatened by a nightingale. This is a collaged piece. There are elements of wood that are adhered to the picture's plane. This is like a proper painting inside of this proper frame. And so elements like this fence, this item, and this are actually extending out of the canvas, out of the frame, and into, very slightly, the viewer's space. So he's taking up where collage had left off in Cubism and making it a little bit more specific. This is a reference to a dream or a nightmare, threatening, makes it a little bit more of a nightmare. But the idea is simple. It's a dream. And at this point, dreams have a place in art history. You can make a painting about a dream, because according to the surrealists, the interior is more important than the exterior. And you can find existence in these interior spaces, in these dreamscapes, that you cannot find or cannot locate in a known environment. Paul Klee's Astrological Fantasy Portrait is also from 1924. So these paintings bubbled up around the time of the first Surrealist Manifesto, but that's not to say that these guys were not Surrealists. They understood this stuff. They were friends with Breton. They had the conversations before the manifesto was published. They were already part of the group, and Breton's manifesto was published to try and get more people on their side. Now this work is a great representation of what I mean when I say automatic drawing. Klee was really wonderful at doing this. So what he did is he would just sit with a piece of paper and some drawing utensils and make shapes, such as this one. He would also make shapes, such as the hat, make shapes, such as this neck. And after making a variety of different marks on the page, he would then pull back and see what he has created. And he, in this work, made something that was similar to a face, made something that was similar to almost like the sized portrait that you would find on a coin, say. So from shoulder to head, a bust portrait is what that's known as. But then there's also a variety of these kind of fairly random shapes that appear. This painting is automatic, but it's reconciled in the waking state. So Klee is not saying, he's not privileging the entire internal perspective. More it's about playing with both, making these things while you're in your dream state, or making automatic marks, and then switching them and making them more narrative and a little more worldly. Surrealism is also one of the first times that the camera really gets a lot of use within artistic practice. There are specific artistic developments that are linked to the camera, but Surrealism is where the camera is brought almost on par with the painter. You have photographers gaining the same kind of esteem, not necessarily the same amount of money in sales of their goods, but the same kind of cultural esteem as the painters. They're at the same tables, they're at the same parties, they know each other, they're friends. Man Ray was friends with Marcel Duchamp in the United States. He then used Duchamp's connections to locate a group of friends in Paris, and he very quickly became part of the same artistic milieu, or the same artistic group. In 1924, he made a photographic object that was referencing a famous painting by our favorite Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres. So in the top corner, the small image that you can see is the painting by the same gentleman who gave us the Grand Odalisque. And Man Ray made this image where he hired a model, put a turban on her head, had her sit with her back facing the camera, and then she dropped her robe in a similar fashion to the Ingres painting. He then realized, after printing it, that her back was very similarly shaped to a violin. And so he used a knife and incised the photograph, actually removing the shapes of what are known as sound holes. And you are all familiar with what those look like on, say, a guitar, or in this case, those are the shapes that would be found on a violin, or a cello, or a more orchestral string instrument. He then put this photograph complete with holes cut out, so that's actually material that's removed, and he puts it on another sheet of paper that is black. And so you have this cavernous system that's set up. It's like a collage in reverse, where the collage artists, including Ernst, were putting things on top of the image. Man Ray is taking them off and creating another visual pun using that image. Here's a few important terms for the Surrealists that we have. I recommend writing these ones down. First is automatic writing and drawing. This was something that was employed by both the writers and the visual artists associated with Surrealism. So it's subconscious word association and mark making. Think of Paul Klee. Stimmung, roughly translated from German to mean mood or atmosphere. If you think back a few slides to Ernst's two children threatened by a nightingale, that would be a Stimmung of a nightmare. It's the threat or the mood of a nightmare. Entier, the surrealist spirit, the motivations / the artistic genius of these people. These artists were pronouncing themselves as being very privileged people within society. They had the ability to see both the subconscious and the conscious through things like automatic writing and drawing, and a game that I'm going to show you in just a second. And so they felt as though they were kind of imbued with the spirit of Entier, the surrealist spirit. And then insolite is the unusual and the strange. Almost everything that I'm going to show you that's relative to surrealism employs something that is unusual or strange. And even in contemporary art, when you look at a work that employs something that is unusual or strange, critics will often regard it as being surrealist or inspired by the surrealist or from the surrealist lineage. So, and that is the insolite. Alright, now I told you I was going to talk to you about a game. This is a parlor game referred to as Exquisite Corpse. And the best way to explain it is to give you the rules. So, you start off with a blank sheet of paper. One person at the table draws one portion of this piece of paper. They then fold it in such a way so that the next artist can see just a little bit, and so you might have just like that line and that line, that line and that line indicated for the next person, and then the next person fills in a similarly sized portion of the page. And so here I've broken up the page for you so you can see that this was passed through 4 different people. Their names are credited there: Yves Tanguay, Juan Miro, Max Maurice, and Man Ray. And so they would pass these things around, and at the end of it, by the time you completed it, so this is 1, 2, 3, 4. You unfold it, and you have this complete drawing that was made collectively, collaboratively, but ultimately links these people because you get a sense of what the common psychology is. Now, the one thing I will say about the Surrealists is the common psychology is often one that objectifies women and puts women in a very uncomfortable position. The idea of the femme fatale, or the dangerous woman, is something that is very key to the way that the Surrealists usually image women. So, yes, these are sexist pictures. Yes, they objectify women. Yes, there are moments where there's almost violence against women in these paintings. And if that is upsetting to you, I am sorry. They are important works of art in letting us understand how society was developing around this time. Women did not have necessarily the most privileged position in society, and these works are merely to give you an understanding of how the world was shaped in 1924 to 1938. So, I'm sorry if some of these things are offensive to you, but this is what someone else has said is important art history. So, this is a work that's covered very in depth in your text. It's The Dance by Pablo Picasso. It is, again, a later stage Cubist work, and I'm going to let Gompertz take the lead on the explanation of this work, but yeah, The Dance, 1925. Also from 1925, we have this guy, Chaim Soutine, who rendered this woman in red in a very brushy and romantic sensibility. I mean, he's very... If Modigliani and Picasso and Matisse are all privileging the more classicist perspective of the French tradition, Chaim Soutine is very interested in the more romantic side of that coin. So where all of those other artists would be looking at Ingres, he would be looking at Delacroix. There's obviously a conversation to be had here about whether or not this is a flattering portrait or an unflattering portrait of this sitter. But I imagine that she's probably very proud to have a work of art that is showing her, but by one of France's more important painters of the day. Hannah Hoch was the collage artist that I showed you last week as giving you Cut with the Kitchen Knife, the last beer belly epoch of the Weimar Republic, or some combination of those words. I always botch that title. Here we have The Sweet One, and Hoch she was never formally part of the Surrealist camp, but because she was one of the smarter Dada artists and because she had developed some level of communication with that group of people, she was aware of what was going on in the Surrealist worlds, and so she began to make work that seemed to be in conversation with it. The interesting thing with her perspective, though, is she is a female artist, and so when she images the female body in these kinds of systems, like The Sweet One, you can see there's indications of contemporary advertising motifs, like these legs are probably from some fashion advertisement, as is this hand, as are these lips, as is this eye. But ultimately, the other thing that's here is this sculpture that comes from sub-Saharan Africa, and she is equating those two modes of representing female participants in culture. So she is she's critiquing the way that men look at women, and she's doing it very, very early. I mean, this is 1926, so she's a pretty rad lady. That's why she deserves lip service when I can give it to her. André Massal's The Battle of Fishes. This is a great work employing the automatic or automatism. What Massal has done, or at least is legend to have done, is made a variety of different marks on a blank piece of canvas, including the pouring of glue and the adhering thereafter of sand, and also freely dripping red ink. And so this stuff here and this stuff here is sand that is adhered to the canvas in an automatic means. Here is red ink, also applied to the canvas very automatically or subconsciously. And then in a similar fashion to Paul Klee, Massal looks at the random or the chance-based elements of this work and then builds a picture around them to suit it. And in this case, we have the battle between two large fish, one right here and one right here. The Battle of the Fishes. René Magritte's The Lovers from 1928. This is probably one of the most famous surrealist works of art. It is one that often gives people the willies, for lack of a better term. It makes people uncomfortable because there is a certain air of sexualized violence in both of these characterizations or both of these depictions of people. They're here covering with their faces shrouded, but they're trying to find that human connection of kiss, of romance. And so, there's a lot of surrealism at play in Magritte's paintings, but he is a very subtle practitioner of the method. And so here he's very quietly telling you that there is in all of us something that is shrouding us. And even those that we care about the most, our dearest lovers, they might not be able to see us for who we are. They still encounter these shrouded veils. Juan Miró, he's one of the other artists that participated in the Exquisite Corpse that I showed you previously. Here we have him making a very automatically rendered but referential painting of a Dutch interior. After traveling to the Netherlands on a research trip, Miró came back to France with postcards, and then he rendered these images, there's 3 of them, from the postcards. But he takes a Dutch interior. This is a very standard pictorial format for the northern countries, an interior scene. It's cold up there, so they're painting a lot inside. Where in France, it's a little more temperate; they can paint outside. So he's taking this very Dutch thing, an interior. He's making it French by making it surrealist, because at this point, surrealism is really only in France. But he's rendering it with a palette that's based in his Spanish heritage. Juan Miró is a Spanish name. He comes from the Castilian area, and so there's a lot of hay, there's a lot of rolling golden fields, there's this blue sky, and so he combines his love of northern painting, his interest in the contemporary avant-garde of his day, and his personal narrative. And he brings them all together in these wonderful series of works called The Dutch Interiors. Now, as I said, surrealism gets, or photography gets a foothold into fine art practice during surrealism, and André Cortege is one of the photographers who really benefits the most from surrealist discourse. So in 1928, he gives us this image where you have what seems to be a train floating above the buildings in this kind of otherworldly landscape where people are above and below. Entire cities can live below trains, and merely the cropping of this image renders it surrealist, because this guy who's walking in the foreground is just going about his day. I live in a neighborhood where there's lots of elevated trains, so it's not that uncommon to see one, but because of how this is set up, because of the disarray of the landscape in the background near the train, it seems as though there's something chaotic happening. Famously, we have Mr. Salvador Dali. Salvador Dali came to understand the surrealists late in the game, but he became friends with them very quickly, and I'll show you in just a moment that one of his works was featured in the publication of the second Surrealist Manifesto. Here we have the Accommodations of Desire, which is a work where Dali, who is very known to create systems of visual language that are based on his own biography, he gives us this work, which is a very early work for this artist. He likens himself to this lion, and so he repeats this lion's mask in a variety of different places. He is the lion. He is tormented. In this top section here, where there are figures, we have the lion's face here representing Dali, but he's involved in a love triangle between Paul Eluard, one of the writers of the Surrealist group, and this woman here is Gala Eluard, who is she's the image that Max Ernst rendered in his portrait of her, and she is here in this Dali picture. Dali and Gala and Paul and Max Ernst, there's a lot of stuff happening there, and this painting is Dali's way of externalizing a lot of the internal struggle that he has with being the other man, but then he becomes not the other man, and Paul becomes the other man. It's this it's very storied, and I don't want to get into that kind of gossipy things. Instead, I want to tell you that this image is incredibly small. Dali brings a level of finish and dexterity and artistic craft to his works that is really unmatched in Paris at this time. And so he makes these very, very tiny paintings that are incredibly nuanced, incredibly in-depth, and very, very striking. Here we have the second Surrealist Manifesto, this quote from Breton: "Let him, in spite of all prohibitions, the avenging weapon of the idea against the bestiality of all beings and of all things. And then one day, when is vanquished, but vanquished only if the world is world, let him greet the firing of sad guns as if it were a salute." All that wraps up to say very simply that the surrealist often will find himself outside the confines of bourgeois society, and as such, if he is a true surrealist, he is privileging this position as being the outsider. Privileging it so much that when the firing squad of bourgeois culture assails him for his bizarre dealings and his bizarre trappings, he greets it as a salute. This is a picture, as I said, by Dali for the cover of this Surrealist Manifesto. Pablo Picasso, Seated Bather. By 1930, you can see that he is fusing his works from 1921. We had a woman and child on a seacoast, in a very, very similar situation. Flat horizon line of the sea, a pale tan sky. You have a female figure sitting on the beach. That said, he is now mixing that with his Cubist sentiment, and here we have the latest phase of Pablo Picasso, the 1930s, where he is making works like this. Salvador Dali's The Persistence of Memory. A lot of people look at this work and they think like, oh, there's so many different ways that you can read it. It's art. It's in the eye of the beholder. Actually, it's pretty simple. When you see clocks melting and they're not moving anymore, then that means that time is not standing still, but it's being recontextualized. It's melting away. Time is taking forever. And if you read the title, The Persistence of Memory, you can see that those clocks are actually supposed to be memories. This landscape is the interior perspective of Dali's mind. Those memories that he has are dripping and melting and probably soon to be coagulating together in the confused mess of blobby clocks, basically. Here we get 3 with a little stopwatch covered in ants, which is a symbolic thing I'm not going to talk about. But this is about Dali's interior perspectives. No work sums up the misogynistic relationship between the surrealists and women better than Woman with Her Throat Cut from 1932 by Alberto Giacometti. It's very hard to see in this slide, but this is the woman's face. There's a small gash right there, an opening similar in shape to the wedge of her mouth. That is the cut throat. This line is one arm, and there's another arm down here that's much smaller. Breasts, an arched back, one leg here and one leg there. I'm not sure what story he's trying to tell with this work, but I do know that this is pretty standard fare for this relationship that the male surrealist artists, almost all of them are male. Hannah Höch was not necessarily a surrealist artist. She was just privy to the information, but she never showed with them. Pretty much only the people that showed as surrealists in the day were men. And a lot of them had these really awkward relationships with women. Now, Giacometti is not glamorizing violence. He's questioning it. This is not him saying that he wants to do this to someone. He's saying that this happens, and he's wondering why it happens. He's wondering how it looks. He's wondering how it's shaped. It might be kind of weird in our day and age of forensic fetishization, where there's 15 different shows that glamorize the inside of a crime lab, which is kind of disturbing when you think about it. Like, why are we so obsessed with knowing how we all die? But in this way, in this sense, Giacometti is abstracting that, and he's interested in the shape of violence. Henri Cartier-Bresson giving us this wonderful shot of a man who seems to be floating in the sky. It's hard to understand what is sky, what is water in this image. And this is a shot taken from behind the train station that Claude Monet famously painted the interior of, that I showed you in the first week. Yves Tanguy. This is representative of a lot of his body of work. He gives us these very dreamy landscapes that don't seem to make much sense, with these little shapes that give a concrete sense of how the world that he's building is structured, but there's no sense of how they operate, what they do. Are they alive? Are they machine-made? We don't really know. Max Ernst here giving us a very disturbing book. Ernst is a weird guy. and he had this pseudonym called Lop Lop, which was a bird-headed man, and he always thought of himself, that was kind of his alter ego. And in this series of collages that he made, you see Lop Lop, who is actually a very vicious misogynist. He does not like women, and he is the place that Ernst takes out a lot of his aggression on women. Now, we do know that Ernst was not an abusive man, but he had a weird relationship with women, and these are a few of these very bizarre little collages that he made, but you can see the violence and kind of graphic and disturbing nature of this stuff. I mean, here we have a bird-headed male figure known to be Lop Lop with a knife in that woman's foot. And in this other image, we have a man who very suspiciously looks at a woman lying in bed while there are two people clinging for life in what seems to be a bit of a whirlpool below. These are disturbing images, that I understand. Here we have another Man Ray photograph. Again, these peculiar representations of women. Hans Bellmer made a photographic spread called Pupille, variations of the montage of one what's that word? Mannequin. So he used this mannequin. He found all of these mannequin parts, and he made these various kinds of collages out of them. Now, obviously, some of these mannequin parts are industrially made, but others are not. I mean, in this image that I'm showing you the larger version of, you can see that the body shape of this figure is very much not of a commercial mannequin. Commercial mannequins don't have realistic bumps in their belly. They also don't have highly rendered genitalia, as Bellmer's image has here. So he took the idea of a mannequin and made it into this very disturbing, expressive conversation on the relationship between men and women in this day and age. And you can see here, Minotaur 6, Winter 1934-1935. This was published in an art magazine. In 1936, female artist Merit Oppenheim made this object, and every art historian that I have ever read, every male art historian that I've read comment on this, always brings up the fact that Pablo Picasso talked to her around the time that she was making this work. Now, that drives me absolutely crazy, because I'm sick of Pablo Picasso getting all of the cred in 20th century art history. B, it's really frustrating that one of the most visible icons of surrealism is a work made by a woman, and that is not given the ability to be a work made by a woman. It has to be, a woman put this together, but it was Picasso's idea. That's dumb. Merit Oppenheim was an up-and-coming jewelry designer, and she found this very luscious material, which is a deer hide from a specific kind of deer in Africa, and she was making bracelets out of it, and she was talking to Picasso about how luxurious they were, and he made a joke about anything covered in this could be luxurious. Oppenheim then made the comment about, I could even cover this cup with this stuff and make this cup more luxurious. She said something, Picasso agreed, she made an example of it. So the idea is hers, this is even more of the legacy of the misogyny of surrealism. It's so anti-woman that they won't even allow a female practitioner the ability to fully author her work. It always has to come with this stamp of Pablo Picasso and his macho-ness. So, moving on. Balthus, the mountain. This is representative of a lot of his works, where we have young people in landscapes, also in interior scenes, and he usually renders these people in the same way that Nabokov structured his Lolita character, where the femme fatale is a younger woman, and that youth is used as a power structure held over an older man. Or at least that's how Nabokov wrote it in Lolita, and that's how almost all of Balthus's paintings incorporating young women are played out. The women in Balthus's paintings always have the upper hand. They're always in control, but they're always in control specifically regarding their sex. It's their femininity, the nubileness of their young bodies that they use as power over the male audience. They're very interesting. They're very complex. There's a lot to talk about in these works. So think about this one. Frida Kahlo, What the Water Gave Me. Frida Kahlo was a painter based in Mexico. She had close ties with Diego Rivera, who was a very famous Mexican muralist at this time. Both of them, not just Diego Rivera, both of them were very radical. Both of them had strong ties to radical art and literature in France and in Europe. Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera invited a variety of different thinkers to Mexico to hang out, including André Breton. And it's André Breton's influence that yielded paintings like this. At a certain point, Kahlo was involved in a very bad traffic accident. She lost the use of her legs for some time and was in bed, basically. During that bed stay, she developed a painting practice. And at one point, while in the tub, she came up with this concept. Whereas she's sitting in the tub, she can't move, she can't even stand up to get out of the tub without assistance, she thinks about all of the different things that are in her life. And so the title, What the Water Gave Me, the water gave her a perspective on which to reflect. And so she has here images of a variety of different things. Her family, the time she spent with Diego in New York. This bird is representative of her. In Firm, this is her broken body. This is a reference to previous love affairs that she had. She was known to be a bit of a bisexual, and the water yielded that kind of reflectivity. I want to show you this Brancusi work. When we talked about him before, but here he is. He was also lumped into this group of the Surrealists, and so his Endless Column fits into this idea of entertaining something that is only conceivable in a very simple, in an interior way, the idea of the infinite. You can't ever image something that's infinite. This is Brancusi trying as hard as he can to do so. Alright. So, I hope you guys took a little break there, because you should have. Because now we're going to move into the other country. And so we are in Germany / the Weimar Republic, or the Weimar Republic, and the dates of this conversation are going to be 1918 through 1932. In Germany, we're going to look at two different camps, one being Bauhaus. Bauhaus is a name that probably a lot of you are familiar with, not only because of the band of this name, but also because in our day and age of privileging craft and privileging basically wood in home design, this is a term that has come up quite a lot in just broader cultural conversations. Simply put, Bauhaus was a school. It was a school in Dessau, Germany, and it was a school that was shut down formally by the Third Reich, who saw it as useless. The school was very interested in the idea of craft. It was very interested in the idea of functionalism. and it was very interested in the idea of craft and art becoming the tools for social change or societal change. They privileged materials that were, they believed, prime, as in they could not be broken down any farther. And that involves wood, glass, steel, and concrete. That's one side of the German coin. The other side of the German coin, and what we're going to look at first, is a group called Neue Sachlichkeit. You don't need to know that name, and you don't need to know how to pronounce it, but you do need to know that Neue Sachlichkeit is German for new objectivity. And what new objectivity privileges is looking at the world in its object form. And so where Surrealism was very much about this interior perspective, and they privileged psychoanalysis over the object, the Germans are privileging the object, but they're allowing a little bit of the psychological reality to come through. That's going to make sense as we talk about this. So, the Weimar works, or the German works from the Weimar Republic, or the Neue Sachlichkeit, have a basis in German Dada. Hannah Höch being the example that I always love bringing up, cut with the kitchen knife Dada through the last Weimar beer belly cultural epoch of Germany. Max Beckmann was a young artist who was very fraught with what was going on in Germany after the war. So basically what happened in Germany after the war is there was a series of cultural revolts within the borders. I said very briefly, or covered very briefly last class, that after the war, the state around Berlin basically became its own republic, and that was not an easy thing. After the war, there was a lot of scrounging for money and trying to find out how to build country back from nothing, because they lost the war and they owed a lot of people a lot of money. And the Weimar Republic arose as a way to safeguard one tiny area of Germany, Weimar. During one of these moments of rebellion, there were raids into private homes of people that opposed the Republic, and this is one of those scenes imaged. There's a lot of reference here to what we know of as being kind of normative wartime actions, the idea of rape and pillage, the idea of death and ripping apart families. All of it is given to us here in Mr. Beckmann's The Night from 1918-1919. Those are the years when the Weimar Republic was in its most chaotic moments of establishing order. If we think of countries like Egypt, or to a lesser extent Iraq, this is what we're seeing in our contemporary world. We're seeing a country like, say, Egypt, that has just gone through a very tumultuous period in its history. It dealt with the Arab Spring 3 years ago. It is now trying to stabilize itself, but in trying to stabilize itself, there's a lot of vying and arguments back and forth. And there's skirmishes between the two camps. Beckmann's painting here gives us that moment in Germany in 1918. Otto Dix, Scat Players from 1920. Otto Dix, I'm going to show you in the next image. He knew Hannah Höch. He was very aware of the Berlin Dada camp. He was involved with them and showed with them. And in this work, we have a very sensitive piece of avant-garde painting. We have 3 soldiers who have returned from war, mangled by the conflict, left to play cards as though they are in 100% working order. That said, they are not. And you can't see because the slide is so small, but This is a small amplifier that is connected to where this soldier's ear would have been. You can see very clearly that he is playing cards with his foot, while his other foot is one peg. As you examine that peg, you see that this other gentleman sitting right here has two peg legs. He also has a prosthetic jaw, as does this fellow, who has no legs at all. But yet these three gentlemen, all wearing their uniforms, sit around and play cards. The cards are actual playing cards that are collaged onto the canvas. In the background, this newspaper is also collaged into the frame. This work is, that's why I say it's a very sensitive work of avant-garde painting, because not only is it talking about the current social climate, it's also employing a variety of different artistic techniques that are, in this day and age, in this specific day and age of 1920, still cutting edge. This is Dix's War Cripples from 1920. This work embodies a lot of the same sentiments as the prior. It's about the lived experience of the returning soldier. These soldiers came back to a country that had no money, and a lot of them didn't see the country as having that much respect for their activities abroad. I try and be as sensitive to these kinds of narratives while teaching these courses, because we are dealing with a very similar situation, and we have been actually since the Vietnam War. When soldiers return to a country that has not specifically won the conflict, because I don't really think that people, well, if the country hasn't quote-unquote won the conflict, the way that soldiers engage with other people in their community is charged very differently. And so the returning soldiers in Germany, they lost. And they didn't just lose their limbs, they lost a certain level of their pride, because not only was the entire world kind of looking at them in a very specific way, but they were also had to deal with a similar thing in Germany. And so here you have a parade of veterans who are in line. They're not on parade and like a ticker tape parade. They're in line probably for benefits. And you can see with the way that this is imaged here, one of them is almost dying as he is standing in line waiting for his benefits. I show you this work again to point out that I said Dix knew Hannah Höch. This is Hannah Höch. This is the Dada show that I showed you, and this is War Cripples. George Gross gave us this watercolor pen and India ink image of Republican automatons. A lot of the people involved with the Berlin Dada were suspicious of the Weimar Republic at its political core, and they had the right to do so. A lot of the people that made up the Republican structure of Weimar were war profiteers. They made a lot of money off of the war, whether or not they won or lost. And they then took over politically, and they did so in a way that involved a lot of aggressive advertising campaigns. And so the artistic camp, like Hannah Höch, like Otto Dix, like Max Beckmann, like George Gross, used the system of that visual language to undermine the Republic's political agendas. The same thing happened in the United States when there was an artistic backlash against the seated President George W. Bush. A lot of the advertising campaigns employed by Bush during and around the lead up to the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan were employed by artists to critique and criticize that government. Very sensitively, we have Kathy Kollwitz, 1923 woodcut called The People. Down in the very bottom of the frame, you can see a strong hand holding tight a young child, trying to shield it from what exists behind that central figure. You have here a mother who is trying to make sure that her young child does not know the true horror of what is going on in Germany at this time. In the background, you have all of these people whose faces are mangled with stress, who are appear almost in the way that we render zombies in our current culture. Those are Germans. At this point, you have hyperinflation. Money is not worth anything, and so a loaf of bread costs several thousand marks because money just isn't worth anything, and so people are going hungry. People are fighting for the key resources to stay alive. And here a mother is trying as hard as she can to shield her child from those realities in hopes that the next day will be better. Here we have another print by Kollwitz. This is Krieg dem Krieg, which is German for war against war. This is a series of prints that she made. Obviously, it's similar to the last print where you have a female figure trying to shepherd children away from the reality of the war-torn reality in the background. All right. So while that's going on in Berlin, in Dessau, we have Günter Stolz making tapestries. Inside of the Weimar Republic, hyperinflation and political angst are at an all-time high. Inside of the German countryside in Dessau, or near the countryside in the city of Dessau, Bauhaus, of which Stolz is a teacher, is trying to make a different kind of social change. So we have Kollwitz here making social change by creating published posters that are used as protest. And here you have Günter Stolz picking up where the avant-garde left off in and around the 1905 era, where they thought that the avant-garde could actively change the world. And also think about the Russians at this time and suprematism. Malevich definitely thought that he was changing the world. Also on faculty at Bauhaus was Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. That's how you pronounce his name, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. This is a work that's referred to as a telephone painting. It's called Construction in Enamel 2. He called an industrial sign painter and had them make this very abstract image according to certain specifications. There are two of these things. One is small, one is large. They look exactly the same. That was part of the commission to this sign painter. Now you might be saying, well, last week we talked about how Marcel Duchamp made Tu or You Bore Me by calling a sign painter. So didn't he do it first? The answer is yes. Marcel Duchamp did pretty much everything first, but we didn't know that he was doing it first until well after the fact. So Moholy-Nagy was doing something new, and so was Duchamp. They just didn't interact with each other, so they didn't know. Also on faculty at Bauhaus, Vasily Kandinsky. Here we have a later work by him from 1923, composition number 8. Here we can see that he is moving very, very far away from any kind of pictorial reality and giving us something that seems almost entirely abstract. Bauhaus hired Kandinsky to be their painting instructor. That was his role in the school, was teaching students how they could make abstract works that were affected by and hopefully affecting change within their contemporary world. This is just a really great print, or a collage rather, by an artist named Paul Citroën. It's of all the buildings that are made using a kind of building system that gave us the rise of skyscrapers. Citroën is instrumental as a element of Bauhaus because in making this collage of all of these different motifs for how you build skyscrapers, we get to this building, the Bauhaus School Building, which was built in 1925, and it employs a lot of the same systems for making buildings. And simply put, if you build a structure out of steel instead of wood or brick, you can build it much higher. And then all of the walls are actually just hanging or latched into that steel structure. And so where in Chicago what they did is they built very tall buildings with steel armature and then adhered more concrete building materials on the outside, or more sturdier building materials on the outside, Bauhaus wanted to privilege the light in their in this school building that Walter Gropius, the head of the school, designed, because he was an architect. And so instead of hanging something opaque, they installed these glass windows. So it's one of the first times really that we have a full glass wraparound of a building. I think it's very interesting that we can see in the span of a few years, or the span of a year, the switch in one artist as he moves from being in Paris around the Surrealists. This is Paul Klee, and he made the astrological portrait. And when he becomes a painting instructor at Bauhaus, he's very influenced by the geometric structure of their visual systems, referenced here by the windows, referenced here by the multiplicity of images of windows of these buildings. Joseph Albers was involved in the glass making at Bauhaus, and here you can see this rigid understanding and employment of geometry is very, very, very central to Bauhaus. And think about that. So in the Weimar Republic, it's chaos. There's all these tumultuous political things going on. People are out of money, people are out of work, people are out of food. It's just chaos, chaos, chaos. And that's how the artist chose to image that world. In the hopes of making a better world, Bauhaus structured their curriculum around something that was peaceful, geometry or mathematics. It's in that placid arena of numbers and of order and of system that they were hoping to create a variety of functional items that could affect people psychologically. You can make them see things in a more calm, a more patient, a quieter way. Two works here by Albers. Obviously they're the same image, just rendered in different colors. Here's a George Grosz painting, The Eclipse of the Sun. In the background you can see what the sun is eclipsed with. It's a $sign or a coin. And this is, these are the war profiteers that I was talking about, and these are the guys who hold power during the Republican period of the Weimar area. It's this guy here, red-faced, a little drunk with power, chubby because he is well-fed. He has his advisor here, also chubby because he is well-fed. And here he has this army of headless yes men who do nothing but say yes to him. And if they don't, he's got that sword on the table that he can just chop their heads off with. It's bleak. The Weimar Republic was a bleak time period. But that said, it was also the period that is fondly remembered in musicals like Cabaret, and in the idea that in Germany there was also the Roaring Twenties. Men wore tuxedos, women wore gowns, everybody smoked cigarettes, everybody drank martinis and champagne. They all went to cabarets to try and avoid the reality of their life. And here we have Max Beckmann, the same guy who gave us the 1919 image, The Night, rendering his version of a self-portrait. So, think about all the self-portraits I've shown you. One, we got Pierre Bonnard, who's imaged in this very stippled, painterly way, holding a paintbrush and palette. Then we have Schmidt-Rottluff, who is, or Pechstein, Schmidt-Rottluff, yes, who images himself with a monocle, also smoking a cigarette. And now we have Beckmann, no reference to him as being an artist, instead him as a gentleman and him as a cultured person. Christian Schad, who last week I showed you some of his Amoret visual images or photographic prints. Here he is giving you a portrait of a very well-to-do man who frequented the nightclubs of the Weimar scene. The Weimar scene was chaotic, but it was also a little debaucherous. And you can see here these two figures near him in sheer gowns are representations of the sexual freedom that was had by people in the Weimar Republic. Now, I say sexual freedom not just because here's this guy who's able to, hire two women, two courtesans at once. I say sexual freedom because one of these two women is actually a man in drag. The pink flowered printed, or flowered embroidered, probably, see-through gown is the representation of a male cross-dresser. This count, we know from historical record, did hold a variety of different tastes when it came to sexual pleasure, and he was not shy to have painter Christian Schad make that central to this portrait of him. This is another image of Christian Schad's working. Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, light space modulator. This is, as the description says, a kinetic sculpture, meaning that it moves. And the idea with this object, it's a static object. It sits in the center of the room. The parts that it is made of operate and move in a very regimented way, but it's also accompanied by a very specific lighting arrangement. That is so that as these things move around, they expose, the light hits them and they charge the entire space. So this is a sculpture that is much more about creating an environment than it is about making something that looks very monumental, that looks very ordered, or is very static. This is Bauhaus. This is new objectivity. This is new objectivity. New objectivity. Bauhaus. Piet Mondrian came to the Bauhaus to be their painting instructor before he would relocate to Paris and then lastly relocate to the United States. So he comes there. He comes in 1930 while he's making works that look like this, but Bauhaus does not have that long of a future in 1930 because we're getting near to the time when Hitler is rising to power. Here's a late work by Paul Klee. This was made while he was still on faculty at Bauhaus. And you can see he is still very interested in the way that geometry is employed. And here I think this work looks quite a lot like the Paul Citrion collage that I showed you earlier. Alright, so really quickly, I want to cover some important pictorial things in the United States. So we're just going to be looking at a brief 20 years. It can be summed up really specifically by saying that The end of the First World War saw the rise of the United States as a global player. That also included the way that it engaged with the contemporary art practices of the day. There is this kind of fusion, or I think a psychological similarity, between how the German New Objectivity movement rendered things as the object was very central in that work. Think of Christian Schad, think of Otto Dix, but the psychology of it all, as is important by the teachings of Freud, is the undercurrent. And so here we have Charles Demuth's My Egypt, and in this work what he is saying is, Egypt's great and all, Egypt has its monuments and its pyramids, but in my country, where I'm from, I see all of that kind of majesty and beauty in something as quote-unquote run-of-the-mill as a very pristine silo. And so here, when I say the psychological undercurrent, I mean the sense of national pride. There is this moment right now, before the financial collapse of the Great Depression, where people are very proud of the landscape that they're from, and they're looking at American history both critically but also in appreciation. Edward Hopper's Early Sunday Morning. This is an image that he rendered of an avenue here in New York City. It still looks like this on Sunday morning. There are not that many people that get up early, so if you're up early enough in New York, you can see this stuff in the flesh. But moving quickly, we have another painter who works similarly to Charles Demuth, Charles Sheeler, who wants to highlight what the American landscape is and the hope and of the American landscape by kind of cleaning it up. So here we have the location of American industry. We have a factory, we have a train yard, we have a waterway. So there's obviously some industrial activity going on right here. But there's no evidence of dirt or grit. Instead, you have a very white, a very cleaned perspective of this. And so in the same way that Demuth is saying, this is my Egypt, here is Sheeler saying, this is the American landscape that we can privilege. It's not just the Wild West. It is actually this industrial powerhouse that we can, if we look at it correctly, it can yield a very positive understanding of ourselves as a young, teetering towards global nation. Grant Wood gave us this famous painting, American Gothic. The painting gets its title from the building style that exists in the background. So basically, you could order. It still happens today. You can order prefabricated homes, and they come in a very specific series of styles. This one, the one that a young farm couple in Iowa purchased, was a Gothic style, meaning that that arched window way in the background, that's a Gothic window. So a little reality about this. This is not a real life married couple. Instead, that's the artist's sister and the artist's dentist, who he had stand for this portrait. This work, like this work from Grant Wood, are meant to be critical of how America sees itself. This work, The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, is meant to look as though a very important story of American history is set in a toy landscape. In other words, he's saying American history is not giving you the full story, it's giving you the child's story. It's giving you just enough information for you to get this sense of glowing pride, but it's not giving you a full criticism. Was Paul Revere really that great of a person? He's not saying that he doesn't like Paul Revere, he's just asking the question about Paul Revere. And in this work, he's asking the question about the kinds of lives that the people in this landscape lead. You have two people imaged here. One is very much older than the other. Neither of them seem to be very happy, but they have this new kind of building structure in the back. So they have a new home, meaning they have a new promise, but they don't seem to be all that excited about it. And so Grant Wood's take on American painting after the war is one that brings a little bit more criticism than other American painters like Charles Sheeler and like Charles Demuth. And that's this. He is much more of the like Neue Sachlichkeit or new objectivity kind of painter in the United States. But there's also much more political painters in the States, Ben Shahn being one of them. Around this time, during a scare of an anti-fascist scare, two Italian immigrants, Sacco and Vanzetti, were put on trial and put to death for a crime that pretty much everybody now admits they did not commit. But because they were Italian immigrants, because as Italian immigrants they had said at some certain times that they were fascist, even though they were not like freedom-hating fascists, like the way that Americans were selling it, and so these men were put to death too quickly without proper trial. So also someone who's critical of the way that America is approaching its new take on becoming a superpower. We're going to skip over this one. So 1936, Ansel Adams, who's one of our most famous photographers, gave us this image of a thundercloud over Lake Tahoe. 1936 is a year that America is in dire straits. The economic fallout of the Great Depression has hit its most... it's in a bad way. Food shortages, the Dust Bowl, the migratory patterns of people are changing. People from the Midwest are moving to California, as was indicated in the novel Grapes of Wrath. There's all of this chaos. There's a population that can't find work, can't find food, can't find money. It's very similar to what's going on in Germany immediately after the war, as evidenced by Kathy Kollwitz's prints. And so here the storm clouds seem to be passing, and so this is Ansel Adams being positive. Here's Walker Evans looking at one of these small buildings. It's a sunny day. All the blinds are closed. All the shutters are closed, and so he is sent out by the U.S. government, like Ansel Adams and like Dorothea Lange, who I'm going to show you next, to photograph what they see and how they encounter Americans dealing with this situation. So after the war, German artists were just left to their own devices, and they developed this visual system that was critical of the culture. And what happened in the United States after the Great Depression is you see people that are much more, artists that are much more willing to be a little more even-keeled about their criticism. Dorothea Lange, Migrant Mother. She was driving down the street one day, Dorothea Lange was, and she saw this family. She turned her car around, went back, and made a series of images, this one being the most famous, where this mother actually has all of her children surrounding her, and they are all wondering where their next meal is coming from, wondering how long they could stay in the shelter that they've built. And so it's a very tense image, but that said, it's also a very scripted image. There are pictures from this same series where the mother is seated alone, the children are alone, the mother's with one child. She published specifically the most dramatic image she could. And this is the last image I'm going to show you today. This is another picture by Walker Evans. He gave you the house in Charleston 2 slides back, and here he gives you the face of someone who is just getting up every day and going to work and trying as best as she can to establish a sense of life in this new American landscape. So by this point, we're well after the First World War. We're getting near to the Second World War. At this point, Hitler has become the Chancellor of Germany, and they are starting their march towards the Third Reich, scarily enough. And in the United States, dealing with economic fallout from the Great Depression, we have photographers who are sent into the field to give you a real perspective of how people are dealing with economic hardships. And on that note, we are done. Again, look for the next midterm review in 2 days. I want to give this lecture time to kind of gestate and have you guys click through it a bunch. So on that, take care.